Welcome back to episode 93 of That So Second Millennium. In this episode, Bill and I have a conversation about the separation between science and philosophy that's grown up over the past 4 centuries. Talk a little bit about the history of the relationship between science and philosophy going all the way back to the ancient world, and how it changed, possibly with William of Ockham, definitely with Descartes, and the current situation where philosophers and scientists go about seemingly pretty ignorant of each other's enterprises. Some of this is the inevitable amount of specialization that comes with the ever-increasing amount of knowledge available to people in the modern world, with all of our information technology from printing on through the internet. But some of it is that scientists and philosophers have really just grown completely estranged and just do not entangle themselves with the other's world. And I discuss some of the problems I, as a scientist, think that probably creates for us, and opportunities that I think we could take advantage of if we could get past that. And especially, note at the end, that Catholic universities would have a special role to play in that, as they are, after all, the inheritors of the great synthesis of the Middle Ages, before all of this great divorce, as Bill calls it, started to happen. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you have any of the books that I suggested that I would like to find but can't, by all means, drop me a line. Let me know some titles and authors. Thanks.
Hello, friends of our podcast, That's So Second Millennium. This is Bill Schmidt, one of the co-hosts, and let me first and foremost welcome my fellow co-host, Dr. Paul Giesting. How are you doing, Paul? Good to be back in conversation with you.
Well, yes, yeah, it's good to talk to you, Bill. It's frankly, it's mid-January in the Midwest, and it's good to have an excuse to be inside doing something as opposed to being outside,
Yes,
tending to household chores or something.
That's right. Is there snow on the ground down in southern Indiana?
Oh, there's just a wisp of snow. It was all. I don't think it made it to 20 yesterday. It is climbing toward freezing. It may not get here. May it get there here today? So, and it's, of course, up in South Bend. I'm sure it's pretty white.
Actually, yeah, not by any means as much snowfall as typical in many past years, but we outdid you on temperature. I think we were at 7 or 8 degrees real temperature and 3 degrees wind chill this morning.
Okay.
So we always have something to keep us awake and alert and angst-ridden and all of those wonderful.
Well, yeah. If it doesn't snow in January, it'll snow in March. As the
That's right.
Continues
exactly.
to cool down and really gets to the point where it starts dumping that lake effect snow.
Right. That's right. That's the angst, the lake effect. So, but I know we had a really enjoyable visit to Purdue and a great conversation with Dr. Thomas Ryba. I'm wondering what's been on your agenda in recent days.
Well, actually, the ideas that I sent to you revolved around something that's been on my mind for as long as the podcast and longer. Is the whole question of the relationship between science and philosophy in the modern era, and the modern era going all the way back to the early modern era, if you will, the late Reformation, the 16th, 17th century, when science as we now know it was really starting to come into existence.
Right.
And yeah, it's been a story. It's been an ugly saga, and it started with an area where there was very little. There's very little of a it's almost like there's sort of a barbed wire fence and a no man's land in between the two disciplines.
Really?
And philosophy has suffered a great deal, and we don't necessarily recognize it in science, but I think science has suffered a great deal from it as well. So that was what I was hoping to talk about today. I'm sort of in the middle of some reading. Wish I was further through it, but life is like that sometimes.
Right.
Dealing with that subject, and of course, unfortunately, talking a little bit about how dissatisfied I am with the reading. If any point, dear listener, during this podcast, if you say, well, he should just read this book, hey, look us up at thatsosecondmillennium.net.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a link. There are links on the right to email both of us. So go ahead and email Paul. of his book
Yeah.
that he ought to read. That's definitely welcome. So
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, we're not exactly the breadth of reading material that you might find in the Oprah reading club. There's only a certain genre that we
there
pursue,
would
so
be
we
some
won't.
overlap, but yeah, it's not going to be the same cluster of books, that's for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. But now I agree with you with that interest in the intersection of philosophy and science. And in fact, I think of the annual meetings of the Society of Catholic Scientists as one of the few places where someone like me, who's not 100% constantly involved in either of those worlds, really ever sees the intersection appearing. Am I right that obviously the early on, well, philosophy was everywhere and science was everywhere, and the intersection must have been pretty broad.
Oh yeah, I mean, you think about, and I'm actually in my daily in my daily spiritual reading, I'm plowing through the book of wisdom right now, and so
Uh,
I've just read. I'm in the middle of the book. I think I just finished chapter 9, uh, and so Solomon, the at least presented as the author of that book,
mhm.
has just gone on this long encomium on, if you have wisdom, you have everything. And you understand the nature of birds and beasts and why the celestial phenomena do what they do. It's all one big integrated whole. You also understand how to live your life and all those other things.
Right,
So, and of course, my understanding is that the Book of Wisdom is commonly thought to have been actually written in the 1st or 2nd century BC. So, in the Hellenistic world, after Alexander the Great, when the whole Eastern Mediterranean, including the Jews, Judea, and the Jews living in places like Alexandria or even as far away as Persia, still in that ambit, still in that world where ideas were traveling back and forth, and that would be Greek philosophy, especially from Socrates on. Yeah, it's all of that stuff. All of
yeah.
that, you can ask questions about all of it, and you can explore all of it, and
And
you're going to use the same sort of reasoning powers to discuss it.
right. And one's general love of knowledge and one's obvious curiosity to understand the world better placed people solidly and immediately and comfortably in the intersection of not only philosophy and science, but theology as
Hmm.
well, I presume.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, as proven by the Book of Wisdom. But that, so now, when you speak about what I'll call the great divorce that seems to have been happening, when did that start happening?
Well, I mean, you look at history, and you can point to a lot of things. You can go at least as early as, say, William of Ockham and the sort of, whatever you want to call it, occasionalism or voluntarism, where to some degree, God is just sort of willing to do things. And of course, people frequently point to Descartes as the initiator of a new movement in philosophy that led to radical skepticism.
Right,
Through people like Kant and Hume, and to the point where you have idealism in philosophy, where we're not really sure, because of Descartes' method. We're not really sure if there's anything outside our own mind, which is, and of course, that's the odd thing about that, is that that's all going on in the same era when science as we know it is coming into being and starting to gain momentum. And of course, science demands, I mean, practically demands psychologically, if not an absolute hard demand logically, that you believe that there's something outside your own mind for you to go
right,
study. You go
right.
study it, you go consult it, you go look at it, you go run
It's
experiments on it. You don't know what the
experiential,
answer
yeah.
is.
Right,
So you're either, you're doing one of two things, logically speaking. You're either plumbing your own unconscious, I guess, the part of your mind that you don't have any control over, or else you're consulting an external reality that has, its own truths, and you don't know them to start with. And that's why the scientific enterprise even exists as we know it, which is to go and consult nature, to come up with some ideas, to go check nature and see if our ideas work out. And if they don't, then to adjust our ideas.
Right.
And that's and that's going on at the same time as philosophy is turning inward and spiraling, inward, if not downward. And to the point where, growing up in the 20th century, you grew up in the 20th century. Philosophers, what do you think of philosophers and the philosophic discipline, by and large? Is it something that, is it the acme of human accomplishment, or is it a bunch of crabbed university professors bickering with each other about things that can't possibly be true or relevant to anything outside their own bickering?
Oh my goodness! I'd have no use for the latter, but I remember when our daughter was going to college. One of my focus points in at least offering advice on colleges and core courses and things. I really wanted her to take a couple of good, solid classical philosophy courses, because I love that idea of being taught how to think and how to analyze, and not to think about just your own little mind that doesn't connect to anything. That's a obviously new and scary concept. I'm thinking of the Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and everything that followed on a good trajectory from them. And what you're saying is that really philosophy has lost that trajectory. It's veered away just almost hopelessly, huh?
Yeah, so the 20th century philosopher and historian of philosophy, Etienne Gilson, fairly famous in Catholic circles, quite famous in Catholic circles. I forget exactly the title of his book. He has a book called Methodical Realism. A good book in itself. It's very short. It's just an introduction to the subject, but it's certainly a book that gripped me with its importance. And of course, he writes about the history of philosophy, and I would have to look up the titles because I didn't think I was going to mention that, but it sprang into my mind as you were saying that. That essentially the history of philosophy, the history of Western philosophy from Descartes on to the present, the mid 20th century when Gilson was writing. This is me adding an interpretation to what he said, but essentially, it's a big experiment in itself. We've tried it. We've tried basing a philosophy on the cogito ergo sum. That's right. Okay. That's my starting point. That's my only starting point. That's really kind of my only axiom. Maybe I'll take a few more logical principles beyond that, but I have to try to construct, in a sense. I have to justify my belief in external reality just starting with that. And so that brings to mind the situation. So my training in logic and reasoning, to the degree you can call it training, was really it's all self-taught, really, and it comes from the direction of mathematics, geometry, and so forth.
Right.
So the example that springs to my mind is non-Euclidean geometry, which is one of the things that, because I was reading about it when I was 12 years old, I assume everyone has, and I don't know that that's really true.
Yeah, I could testify that it's not, I'm afraid.
Okay, so this allows me also to work in an anecdote about Bertrand Russell that may not be as generally known as some anecdotes about Bertrand Russell.
Okay.
You're familiar with Bertrand Russell, or at least the concept of the man. Very famous mathematician and atheist philosopher. One of the old atheists, as Pat Flynn calls him. Not just Pat Flynn, but the crop of atheists in the late 19th and early 20th century. In any case, so I read a book, one of the earliest books that I read, that was sort of this exploring mathematics. It's called Great Theorems in Mathematical History or something like that. And it starts with the prologue, or the preface, gives or one of the very early chapters, the first chapter perhaps, talks about Greek geometry, but it gives this anecdote about Bertrand Russell and his brother starting to teach him Euclid's Elements. Right, it's for the most successful textbook of all time, because it was written in 300 some BC, then was still being used as a textbook in the 20th century. For all I know, it's still being used as a textbook somewhere for geometry, because it is that good. It's not without flaws, but it is that good. And so, but it starts off with its geometry, so you need a bunch of things you can assume from the start, and then you can go on. So it's, he starts with a bunch of definitions, and then, a modern mathematician would say, well, that was a nice, attempt for pre-modern, but, you just kind of have to take point, line, and plane as just things that you can't even define, but you take them as given. But Euclid tries to give definitions of them, like a point is that which has no part, and a line is a series. I forget the definition of line. A straight line is a line with the points on the line lying evenly with themselves. You can sort of see what he's trying to get at.
And I love that kind of exercise of trying to define your terms. It's a good exercise for all sorts of reasons.
So book one starts with 20 odd definitions, if memory serves, 5 postulates, and then 5 common notions, which we would just call them all axioms, perhaps, in modern logical nomenclature. So he starts off with at least 23 definitions and 10 axioms, or maybe 33 axioms, whatever you want to call it. So the postulates are, the common notions are things like, if you add equal things to equal things, the sums are equal. Sort of common sense stuff, hence the name common notions.
I see.
The postulates are more about mathematical objects. And they are also pretty straightforward. Like you can take a line and extend this, you can extend any straight line as far as you want to. Until you get to the 5th postulate. And the 5th postulate says if 2 straight lines are crossed by a 3rd straight line, and they make the angles on one side less than 2 right angles, then the first 2 lines meet on the side on which the angles are less than 2 right angles. It's a lot longer and more involved, and people hated it from the word go. They looked at it like, what are you doing? Because, Euclid was one of the early people to actually try to lay out some kind of systematic view of geometry in general. And so this 5th postulate irked people, and it's logically entailed in a lot of basic things you'd like to have in geometry. He ends up using it. It's in the foundation of what you need, for example, to prove that all triangles have angles that sum to 180 degrees.
Well, that's pretty important.
Yeah. So people have been trying to prove the 5th postulate. People tried to prove the 5th postulate from the other postulates, the common notions, and so forth, from Euclid's time all the way into the 19th century. And what turned out around the beginning of the 19th century, what turned out to be the case is that people got so good at manipulating the logic, and there was so much work that had been done for other people to build off of, that people like Gauss and some of his contemporaries finally worked out that, in fact, the 5th postulate doesn't have to be the case. You could have, so what the 5th postulate is telling you essentially is how to find out if 2 lines are parallel or not. Right?
Okay.
If you have 2 lines that are parallel, they'll never meet each other, right? That's our common idea of Euclidean geometry.
That's right.
There's such a thing. And that carries a lot of other implications. They're always the same distance from each other. And then that whole business about if you cross them with a 3rd line, the 2 angles will add up to 180 degrees on either side of that line, which is sort of a logical, turnabout of the 5th postulate as it's actually laid out in Euclid, which is sort of the way I described it. I won't vouch for its exact precision. But as it turns out, you can build a completely consistent geometry where none of that is true. And in fact, you can build at least 2 different geometries where none of that is true.
Oh my goodness.
And they seem to describe spaces that, broadly speaking, are like if they were wrapped around a sphere, or if they were wrapped around sort of an infinite saddle shape. Then you would find that the lines that stay within those sort of surfaces, I mean, this is kind of crude, but it is the most it's probably the easiest way to visualize these alternative
Right.
geometries. So in the spherical one, for example, if you have two parallel lines, they're going to cross each other somewhere around that sphere.
Huh.
And the angles in a triangle that are drawn on the surface of a sphere, those arcs are going to cross each other, and the angles are actually going to add up to more than 180 degrees.
My goodness.
And it's all consistent. You need the fifth postulate to specify which geometry you're in.
Ah.
So this is where, okay, so that was a long parenthesis, and I'm sure you're wondering where the heck I was going with this. But the point is this. We need at least a second postulate, besides cogito ergo sum, to do philosophy. I think this is what I take from Gilson.
Okay.
We need a realist postulate. There's something outside my own mind. Period. There is. I take that as granted, and I go on from there.
Right.
And my sense inputs tell me something about that external world, and then we have to qualify that. And we can use both philosophical and scientific methods to think about that and qualify that and be precise with that. But they tell us something.
Right.
We are interacting with a world that's not just us. That's not just the contents of our own mind.
Right.
But that's where philosophy has gotten lost. I mean, certainly in the mid 20th century, it was mostly lost out in those weeds, and people were starting to try to do other things.
Yeah.
But so the problem is that scientists and philosophers, of course, the other problem is just that since the advent of publishing, printing, the amount of information that's available in the world has just continued to mount up and up and up and up and up. And so you can no longer master all of mathematics. You can no longer master all of philosophy. You can no longer master all of, quote, natural philosophy or modern science. You can't even master all of physics. You have to specialize. And so, of course, that's an inherent problem. So scientists and philosophers are not only ignorant of each other's disciplines, in those huge bins. Of course, they're sort of ignorant of, we're all ignorant of the details of other people's specialties. And what we're going to do about that ultimately is an interesting question.
Yes. Yeah, we're drawing too deeply into the separate silos where no conversation is possible.
Yeah, it gets to the point where there's almost very little, the conversations we can have with people outside our own silo are by sheer force of necessity pretty superficial.
Yeah. Gee, and that's scary, and it also seems to run counter to the whole originating principle of the university, that there was some kind of unit of force between, among the different disciplines of knowledge.
Yeah, and that's gosh, I was just finishing listening to Bishop Barron's series on John Henry Newman, who of course talks about the idea of the university. And that's interesting in that context too. And it is the push toward specialization is a very thorny problem, but there's still more of a gap than there needs to be, and there are clear benefits that, to me, there are very clear benefits. Having been a practicing geoscientist and read a whole bunch of geoscience papers and a fair number of proposals, and evaluating the work of other scientists, and even looking at the way I myself do work, I could have benefited from more of a training in logic, whether it needed to be formal symbolic logic or not. But that's not done anymore. I mean, we have mathematics classes and they wander through a lot of proofs, but a lot of people can get a PhD in geoscience, I can testify, without having really understood a whole lot of the mathematics. They can crank it out and do what's considered necessary. They don't necessarily know why.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily that different from the way it was in the past, but it's if it's always been a problem, then it's still a problem.
Yeah. And if they were having trouble discerning a purpose behind what they were doing, that was when they would turn to, if they were a scientist, they would turn to a book of philosophy. Or if they were a philosopher, they would turn to a book of science, or simply just be part of the broader intellectual communities that were
Right.
hopefully
Yeah.
forming and really dynamic.
Yeah. And I think there's a vast area that has barely been scratching. So that's why I'm intrigued. It's like I was talking before we started the recording here. So I've picked up the Condix book. So we talked to Maureen Condic last summer, the Society of Catholic Scientists conference. And so I did indeed order and begin reading. There's another book that I want to finish before I push any further into their book on basic metaphysics. But so that's what's being laid out, and that was what was the intriguing promise to me that she essentially made during that interview, is that in that book they go and they deal with the specific, they get into the quote weeds,
right?
Which is sort of a business person expression, I think. Oh my gosh, the actual detail. Oh, God forbid we deal with the actual details of how this works, but.
Right.
But that's I don't think that gets done. Maybe it gets done, and again, this is where, dear reader or dear listener, if you know where this is being done, drop us a line. Drop me in particular a line.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's anywhere near enough work done, and it seems very pedestrian and plebeian, and I can see why from a wanting to be cool and happening and get tenure and all that sort of thing and get published and get cited a bunch. People don't necessarily do it, but I think there's an enormous amount to be done in terms of taking even the everyday things, even the sort of pre-modern physics weirdness of entities, like even just like a tectonic plate. What is a tectonic plate? What is it really? What does its matter? What is its form? How are we going to map those terms directly onto that? And if that's an easy enough problem that we can come to a solution that we agree on, let's push on. What's a mineral? How could we or how should we define what a mineral is?
Yeah.
It's a genus of things, so this specific mass of stuff is the mineral quartz. Okay, it's alpha quartz. Yes, I know it has this structure. What's the matter? What's the form? What is its actuality? What is its potential? If we want to take the Aristotelian Thomistic, which I'm certainly not aware of a better realist metaphysics out there at this point. And I'm just knowing what I know about the progress of science, I just can't picture that process not leading to a large number of important refinements to our philosophic concepts. I mean, by the time you've done that with ordinary objects, then we can start dealing with the objects of quantum physics and relativity. And let's see where we're at. And I just can't imagine that process not turning up. But you have to do the work. I mean, you would have to slog through a lot of slow arguments about specific things. And unfortunately, we live in a world where scientists have for centuries now kind of, philosophy, blah, it's not that interesting. I mean, even there's like a quote from Richard Feynman of all people. One of the most brilliant people of the 20th century. But he's supposedly quoted as saying something like, scientists need a philosophy of science the way birds need to know ornithology. Sneering at the concept, which is like, that's one of the dumbest things ever said.
Yeah,
like,
really.
How can a bird not benefit from knowing ornithology?
Yes.
Seriously? You could say that?
Why
would you? How could you not benefit? And I consider myself very fortunate in that I actually had, and I don't think many people get this at all, but I had in my undergrad program at Washington University in St. Louis, all like 5 of us that graduated in that major in the year that I graduated. But we had a capstone class that delved into philosophy of science, history and sociology of science.
Right.
Read some Popper, read some Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, looked at some papers and the foundations of our field, and looked at the structure of the plate tectonics paradigm shift that happened within people's working lifetime. Certainly at the time when I was in school, people who were working in the 60s were still working at university jobs in large numbers in the 1990s. So this had all happened within institutional living memory.
That's scary.
And it's a fascinating story. It was just this idea, this master idea that sent its roots out all the way through and just reoriented everything. all sorts of things that seemed, to be disparate, or that we had really terrible we had really terrible placeholder ideas for how mountains were built, as a sort of outstanding example. The
Right.
geosyncline idea, it was garbage. It was such garbage.
Wow.
And we still use some of the terms that descend from that time, but now they live in the plate tectonics paradigm, where there's a purpose for all of it. I mean, we could describe, okay, well, mountains get raised, and there are these basins on either side, and stuff erodes off the mountains into these basins, and we could call it this and this and this and this, and that's all fine. But there was no causal principle that could be found that could make anything like sense of why there were mountains in the first place doing all these things. And that's the sort, we had to make observations. We had to pile up enough weird things, and especially weird things about the seafloor ended up being what cracked the puzzle for geology. Once we started measuring magnetic stripes in the seafloor, and then wondered, what in the heck is the Earth telling us now?
Wow.
All of a sudden, things started crystallizing, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
To use another geologic metaphor.
Right.
Yeah, and I just can't imagine that a process like that not happening several times if we really, really did the work of basic metaphysics of modern science. Got the ideas out there, hammered on them. Because I don't think, I mean, the stuff that I do read, and of course the stuff that I have read suffers from being fairly elementary, but even at that elementary level, I think they could do a better job of describing the reality that I've come to know. A lot better job, frankly. And once, one final note, if this is out there, in whatever field of physics, of biology, certainly geology, let me know. Give me some titles. Give me some authors, give me some titles. But I don't think it's out there. I don't think anywhere near enough of it is out there. And that's what I hope to get out of the rest of the Condix book, is at least tangling with that. And of course, the Condix book has the motivation of, we're dealing with human life, and
well, that's
basic
right. Yes.
basic places where human life is being destroyed, and philosophic or sham philosophic arguments are being advanced to justify it.
Yes.
Okay, with that motivation, we can maybe
moving in sync. Yeah.
Yeah, we can maybe finally, eventually get to the point where we do the philosophy. But yeah, if we don't have that overwhelming motivation, apparently it won't get done, and that's a tragedy.
And the ultimate tragedy is, what would you say? Ultimately, that whole ethos of genuine curiosity and using knowledge to generate more and better questions, without an awareness of philosophy, without an embrace of philosophy as a love of knowledge, science loses that driving force of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Is
I mean, maybe we could go all the way back to scripture again and say we've lost the sense of wisdom, and wisdom perhaps in the sense of seeing things from the furthest possible distance that we can reach with our own human perspective.
Yes. Yeah.
And ultimately, to see things integrated to the highest degree that, again, we can with our limited human perspective.
Curiosity and wisdom are kissing cousins. Whereas I think the general assumption in today's popular culture is that if you have wisdom, you don't really need curiosity. You know all you need to know.
Or if we even use the term wisdom at all, and we don't just substitute knowledge as having
we barely
dumpster full of facts.
That's right. Internet is not seen as a conveyor of wisdom.
No.
That somebody better be a conveyor of wisdom, and ultimately it's up to each individual to take the internet that far. But well, it's fascinating, and so what you're doing is really laying a groundwork for kind of a renewed challenge, which kind of harks back to some of the earlier episodes of our podcast, doesn't it?
This is definitely a harking back to some of our early episodes.
Yeah, I like it. Well, and as you read more, especially into the Condix book, I'll be very interested in in talking with you about that.
And as a parting shot, just to think that, if any institutions in the world were to try to tackle this problem head on, you would think it would be Catholic institutions.
Amen.
And maybe that is happening somewhere, but hopefully we can talk about that in the future.
Very good. Yes, very good. That's another purpose of our podcast. Yes.
If you enjoyed this episode, or it made you think, please subscribe to That's So Second Millennium via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Podbean, or your podcast service of choice. Our intro music is Mars, the Bringer of War, and our outro music is Venus, the Bringer of Peace, from the Planet Suite by Gustav Holst, performed by the U.S. Air Force Heritage of America Band. The recording is in the public domain and made available by museopen.org. For my co-host Bill Schmidt, I'm Paul Giesting. Thanks for listening to another episode of That's So Second Millennium.